Okay, hi all. I'm very pleased to have here with me Chris Starmer and Orestis Kopsacheilis, following their talk on decision from experience in environment with individual and social uncertainty, which I will put in the link. If you have not heard it, you can hear it because it was recorded. So thank you guys for coming, and this is a follow-up conversation. And Chris, I would like to start with you if you don't mind. Can you please explain your findings to an undergrad student from unrelated field or even a layman?
Sure. Well, I'll give it a try. And just before I dive into that, just let me say sort of thank you for the opportunity to be involved in the very nice seminar, really nice experience. Orestes and I gave a joint talk, and we talked about a range of work that's sort of on a connected or has some connected themes. What I spoke about was work that I've been doing with collaborators on the topic of choice overload. And choice overload is there's a sort of background literature to what we're doing that suggests that giving people more choice can make them worse off. And that's an idea that seems surprising to a range of people, but although there's quite a lot of work done on it, it remains a controversial idea, partly because um, why it happens isn't very well understood, but there's also a question about how replicable some of the results are that are claimed to demonstrate that. So our work really started with two objectives. One was to see if we could look for choice overload in an experimental environment that we designed so that if we found evidence of choice overload, we'd be persuaded it was a real phenomenon. Of course, open question whether other people would be persuaded, but we were trying to persuade ourselves whether or not we could find it in a place where we thought, yes, this looks like a sort of convincing evidence of the phenomenon to us. And if we could, then try and sort of explore what was causing it. And so we look for it in what we think of as a sort of a computerized virtual shopping environment that's meant to mimic aspects of consumer search. So what we're thinking here of people searching amongst multi-attribute objects where we've got sort of stylized objects, but they're meant to represent things like kind of trying to buy a new car, for instance. So if you think of the problem of trying to buy a new car, you've got to search around and think what sorts of vehicles are in the market and what characteristics have they got. And inevitably, you're needing to do a bit of search, find out what there are, and then to make a choice, you've got to trade off the different attributes that the vehicles have got. So, I might sort of really like that expensive Ferrari, but I might have to settle for that eco-friendly, more economical Toyota. So that's the kind of environment that we're trying to sort of mimic or capture stylized features of. And we do it in a setup where people as individuals are making choices. And in the background, they don't know this, but in the background, there's a very large range of objects, thousands of objects. And in an environment, these objects are essentially quite simple. So we represent a multi-attribute object as essentially on a computer screen, a set of boxes, and in each box is an amount of money. But you only find out how much money there is in each box, the value of each attribute by opening the box and finding out how much money there is. So in this environment, you'll see a lot of rows of boxes, and you've got to do some opening of boxes to try and search amongst the attributes. And we think people will want to try and make as much money as they can in that environment. And how much money they make is a signal of how well they're doing in our environment. And then one of the key questions we're interested in is if we give people more boxes or more rows of boxes, more products to search amongst, will they do better or worse? And you might think, well, there's a reason to think they'll do better because we're going to, in the selections we give them, we're going to randomly select from that set of 1,000 objects. And so if we give them a bigger selection, then on average, there are going to be better options in there. products that have got sort of more money behind the boxes. And by the way, at least in one of the environments, the way they get paid is according to the average payoff in the set of boxes. That's their reward in at least one of the environments. And one of our key findings is really that if we give them more boxes, they tend to do worse. We give them more products rather, they tend to do worse. So the range we're looking at is, say, from offering them 10 objects and allow them to search around those and pick one, up to searching around 50 and trying to find the best thing. And they do it in a time-limited environment, so they're time constrained in doing this. And we find bigger selections lead to them earning less money. And we're thinking, well, we think this is pretty good evidence of choice overload. And one of the reasons for thinking that is that, suppose that we gave them 10 objects to search. Think about their average performance there. If you give them 20 objects or 30 objects, if they were searching optimally, they really shouldn't be doing worse, because any form of search that they could do with 10 objects, they could also do with 20 or 30 objects, because they could just ignore any number beyond 10 of the objects and they ought to do just as well as whatever search process they're applying 10. So we think this is pretty persuasive evidence of choice overload. And so we've then got various ways in which various manipulations we use and forms of analysis we use to try and find out a bit about what's going on. And I'll just tell you a couple of headlines about what we think is going on, and then I'll stop, because I'm absorbing a lot of our interview time. But one of the things that we think is going on, when you give people more options to search amongst, then they do what they think is taking advantage of the extra options. But one of the trade-offs that probably they're not taking account of enough is that by searching across more options, they're learning less about the individual options. So they've got kind of more sparse information about the set of objects. And it turns out, we didn't know in advance this would be what was driving it, but it turns out that trade-off is bad for them, or where they are in that trade-off, trading off the number of objects they're considering against the richness of information. They're doing that in a way that looks to be suboptimal. And then we also measured lots of characteristics of the agents, like how they feel about uncertainty. Are they content choosing options that are ambiguous, or do they prefer to look at alternatives where they know as much as possible about them? And for lots of the things that we measure, that doesn't make much difference. But one thing really stands out as being an important determinant of whether they suffer from overload, and that's how they score on a very simple self-report of how impulsive they are. And the direction of that effect we found quite interesting. We hadn't predicted this, but we've sort of discovered it ex post, and that is, people who are more impulsive do better in our environment, in the sense of being less prone to overload. So being impulsive is good for you. And I suppose there's sort of a lot of literature that's looked at the impacts of impulsivity, a lot of it in psychology. And on the whole, in lots of study of the impact of impulsivity, it turns out that being impulsive isn't that good for you. We're one of those environments, not the only one. We've actually sort of looked at some of the psychology literature later and found that you do find this in other places, but in relation to choice overload in our environment, being impulsive, it's a positive trait. So that was really what I wanted to say about our results.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I have, if you don't mind, two quick follow-up questions.
Sure.
Question first. So basically, if I understand correctly what you say, the business model of, for example, Costco, and I will remind our listeners, Costco is a very big store with a very limited number of products in each category. You say it's a good business model in this sense. It might lead consumers to
Well,
better choices?
well, it may. I mean, I suppose an aspect of our results. I mean, in some sense, we can't say, well, look, it's a good business model, because there's obviously there's lots of businesses that do very well by offering people lots and lots of choice. So if you think about, online retailers like Amazon, they're clearly hugely successful by offering enormous amounts of choice. Of course, one of the things that they do, they also have, algorithms built in and mechanisms built in that allow people to sift. So it might be that those algorithms are helping people to solve an overload problem. But another possibility is that, in fact, that firms that offer lots of choice, it's good for the firms, but maybe the consumers are suffering from a degree of choice overload without knowing it. Sometimes we're suffering from choice overload and knowing it. So I think of sort of, those unhappy 30 minutes when, as a family, we spend, we effectively lose time by searching through Netflix to find something that we want to watch. And there, I think, if we had 2 or 3 alternatives, we'd probably quickly pick something. But with thousands of alternatives, we get kind of mired in this search, which sometimes leads to the family group splitting up to go and do other things. So I think it's a familiar problem. But there certainly may be particular consumers who are attracted to that limited choice option. So it's probably catering to a niche market, isn't it? Well, I think we know it's catering to a niche market.
By the way, it happens to me more than once with my wife when we are abroad and search for a restaurant. We definitely suffer from choice overload. Have not thought about it in this way, but this is definitely true, at least for our family. Yeah. And my second question, maybe it's a bit irritating, but I will still ask it. What do you think would happen if there was no time constraint? Because the thing is, then there is the point of individual cost of time, obviously. But if you think about, for example, searching for a hotel or searching for an airline ticket, so then basically you have no constraint, right? Just in the sense that only your time is what matters. So what do you think will happen to your results?
Well, I don't think it's a perfectly reasonable question, and as it happens, one of the things that we manipulated was the time constraint. So we were sort of interested in what is time doing, and so part of our results that I didn't talk about is that in one of our environments we allow the participants to choose themselves how many objects that they want to look at. And one consequence of that is that we discover people sort of people create endogenously an overload problem. So it's not just about sort of choice architects imposing too much choice on people that generates the problem. People sometimes do it to themselves by kind of picking a range of objects which is probably bigger than optimal. And in the environment where we were doing that, we also varied the amount of time that they had. And what we find is that we find a sort of an inverted U-shaped relationship between the size of the shortlist that they pick for themselves, measured on the horizontal, and their performance in terms of how much money they make on the vertical axis. So that has a sort of inverted U shape. So it's like you've got to pick enough objects to climb up the performance scale, but as you pick more and more objects, you then start to descend the performance scale. And what we found is that if you allow people more time, the position and shape of that hump changes. So give them more time, and the hump moves to the right and spreads out a bit, but you've still fundamentally got a hump shape. So I think of that as a sort of partial answer to your question. Well, we know what happens when we vary the time that's available. We've looked at that. What if there's no time at all? And I suppose my position on that is, you know, it's probably not meaningful to think of people making any decisions with unbounded time. You know, for any real decision, implicitly there is a time limit. You know, ultimately we all die, so you know any decision has ultimately a finite time. And I suppose I think that for lots of shopping decisions, we're probably allocating ourselves at least implicitly amounts of time. The new car problem, oh, I'm going to sit down on Sunday and think about this, or you know, through my days and weeks, I'm allocating bits of my time to thinking about this problem. And so I think, in fact, there's always a time limit.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. Orestis, moving to you, can you please tell us about your part of the research that you presented?
Yes, so my presentation was focused more on a topic that is very thematic to the seminar, so the description experience gap. So in a nutshell, the phenomenon posits that people's risky choices differ depending on whether they learn about uncertainty through some kind of numerical description or whether they learn through some kind of experiential process where they experience outcomes sequentially. And specifically, when people learn from description, they make decisions that seem to suggest that rare events play a very important role in their decision. While when they learn from experience, these rare events are either receiving less attention than description, or sometimes they're even completely ignored. So, for example, if you read some report that tells you that there is a 10% chance that your investment might depreciate, lose value, you might be more cautious, you might be more alarmed than if you infer this probability by kind of personal experience by observing outcomes on a day-to-day basis. And so in the first part of my talk, I described work that I've developed with Chris Starmer and Robin Cubitt. And there we focused on kind of pulling apart the factors, the most discussed factors that might be driving this kind of disparity between description and experience. And there, in a series of treatments and a laboratory experiment, we manipulated several effects, some pertaining to preferences, some pertaining to statistical information, some pertaining to kind of properties of our brains, such as memory limitations. So, for example, in some cases, we recorded the inexperienced events that people sample. In some other cases, we didn't. In some cases, we allowed people to collect biased information, so not to collect enough information and have biased samples. In other cases, we forced them to collect enough information so that they experienced exactly the same probabilities as people in description did. In another case, we made sure that there is some remaining uncertainty in experience regarding the information they collected. In other cases, we told them that now you have seen the entire distribution, right? And so by comparing these on and off treatments, we isolated the effect of each of these factors that I mentioned before. And what we find is that really the strongest case for the classical description experience gap is in the presence of this statistical bias, when people do not search enough and sometimes underrepresent or completely disregard the low probability event in their experiential sample. But interestingly, beyond that, we found very stark similarities with of statistical sampling bias with memory limitations. So when people do not have access to this kind of summaries, of the outcomes they sampled, they tend to kind of behave as if they exhibit a sampling bias, statistical bias in their brain, whereby they kind of maybe remember a subset of their observations and make choices as if kind of underweighting these likelihoods of those low probability events. So I think getting a firm grasp of these factors that are driving the description experience gap is important, because nowadays in our daily decisions, both experiential and descriptive information is available. So it's important to know, how these features influence our decisions. In the second part of the talk, I kind of presented some more recent work that focusing on exploring the gap, but beyond the more narrow frame of individual uncertainty, where outcomes depend on stage of nature. Will it rain tomorrow? Will the economy improve, or will inflation get worse? And there, specifically, together with Danny van Dolder and Ozan Isler, we are exploring how the dynamics of this gap play out in situations where we have social uncertainty. Like deciding whether to collaborate with someone. It's very much depends on your belief about how cooperative they are, right? And in these environments, perhaps surprisingly, we find that the gap looks very, very different than individual uncertainty situations. In particular, we find that a key to understanding the differences between the two domains hinges on understanding how fixed or how sticky our beliefs are in light of new information. And in the environments that we explored, it turned out that we tend to be much more stubborn, much more reluctant to update our beliefs in social rather than individual uncertainty. Of course, there is much more to explore there, and much of these kind of open questions that we identify are very interdisciplinary in interest. So I encourage anyone intrigued by these questions to delve into the literature of the DE gap, description experience gap, regardless of their academic background, and let's join forces in pursuing these questions.
Thank you. This is very interesting. One follow-up question. So if I understand correctly, the first part that you talked about, so basically what you say, if I do not have a biased sample, but rather a representative sample, then, or if I'm kind of very smart person, very smart in the sense that I have a very good memory, sharp memory, then the description experience gap should be reduced, eliminated, or at least reduced. Do I understand you correctly?
That's what we found, yes.
That's very interesting. And regarding the second part, so basically, can you connect it in a sense to the hot stove effect? Hot stove effect, I mean about getting, when you get only partial feedback about the environment, because if you get partial feedback, then you learn less about the social uncertainty, I think, than if you have a full feedback of the environment. I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe I'm
Yeah. So I think I think this is a great point, and it's a good opportunity to clarify two distinct ways in which experience is implemented experimentally in the lab. So in the type of experience that we implement, you can think of it as kind of an indirect experience, where you observe the outcomes, but you don't directly incur the consequences of these outcomes personally. You might be observing outcomes in the stock market before you choose to invest, or experiences of your friends before you make a decision yourself. And there is another paradigm that instead makes every sample choice consequential. So every time you observe an outcome, you incur the consequences of this outcome to your personal payoff. And the hot stove effect, I think, applies more to this latter way of experience. So the hot stove effect is when you burn your hand in a hot stove, right? So you will tend to avoid putting your hand in the stove, irrespective of whether the stove is on and off, right? In the example of the restaurant decision that you mentioned earlier, if a restaurant has a high success rate of delivering good experiences, but you go and it so happens that you just have a bad experience the time you went, you won't go back and then appreciate the fact that it was actually not that bad of a restaurant, right? So I think that would be the biggest asymmetry between the type of experience that we observed and the type of experience that allows for hot stove effects. In our case, sampling or collecting more information is very cheap. There is only time constraint considerations, but there is not consideration of this exploration exploitation trade-off. So, but even though in principle the hot stove effect shouldn't really play a role, it's kind of a new idea, and I wonder if there is some kind of hot stove effect in the brain. So even if there's no consequences in the outcomes at the time you explore them, whether we are able to replicate a similar pattern of choice if we think about how people searched under kind of the more consequential sampling paradigm. So something to look into.
Okay, thank you. Orestis, if you don't mind, I will continue with you and moving from your research guys, to more general questions. What is, in your opinion, the most pressing issue in social sciences nowadays, and how can your research be expanded to address it?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So in my mind, but I think not just in my mind, but in many researchers' minds, the most pressing or maybe disconcerting issue facing at least social science today is the replication crisis. And this refers to the fact that several studies across several social sciences are difficult or even impossible to reproduce or replicate. And of course, this not only undermines public trust in science, but it also clouds our own judgments and researchers' understanding of the true effect size of the phenomenon that we are studying. And there are several factors that are being discussed as to contributors to this problem. Some are institutional, like publication bias, some are statistical in nature. But I'm currently exploring a more behavioral dimension of this phenomenon, and one that actually borrows some ideas from the methodology of and the insights of the description experience gap that we mentioned earlier. So a common response to the replication crisis is to conduct meta-analysis on various behavioral phenomena. So these are essentially studies of studies that summarize findings by compiling and calculating an average effect size and providing its distribution across past studies. And on the one hand, kind of the arguments in favor of doing more and more meta-analysis are very compelling. It's a very convenient way of presenting findings in an easy to process manner. On the other hand, there may be unintended consequences, right, from an increasing over-reliance to such descriptive snapshots of the literature. And we may be missing something by kind of moving away from this more old school way of informing our hypothesis by conducting a more cumbersome literature review where we go sequentially one by one through the relevant papers and read carefully through the more nuanced points, as well as understanding the context of these studies in more depth. And so the idea here is to draw a parallel between decisions from description and kind of the meta-analytic information and decisions from experience and the more systematic reviews, and test which mode of learning or its combination of modes of learning is more effective in predicting effect size. And so I think as the discipline is moving forward, adapting these kind of new methods, I think it's kind of good to know now, or rather sooner rather than later, if there's potential backfiring effects from this kind of suits in methodology. So yeah.
Thank you. This is very interesting point of view of looking at the description experience that I have personally have not thought about it in this way, and I definitely agree with you that the replication crisis is a very big problem in our field. It harms the trust in our field, etc., etc. Okay, Chris, we will move to you now. And I would like to ask you, what is your vision for our community, let's say 10 years from now, but feel free to answer for any other number.
Yeah. And actually, I think I maybe want to connect this to at some point to what Orestis just raised and you sort of endorsed as a big problem, replication crisis. Maybe I can get there because I think I maybe have a slightly different take on it.
Sure.
So you said what's our vision for our community? I mean, to me, I think it in some sense it raised the question you pose makes me question, well, what do I think of as the community that I'm part of? How do I define that community? And what do I think of as vision? You know, is that let me deal with the second. Is vision about kind of prediction? Where do I see it going? Or is it about prescription? Where do I think it ought to be going? And I'll kind of come back to that. But in terms of the community, I suppose, you know, if I think what community am I part of, most obviously part of, or have kind of closest affinity to as a researcher, and there I suppose, you know, I do somewhat that connects with the sort of the more sort of focused community that connects to this seminar concerned with experience and behavior, but I don't think of that as sort of, you know, there are connections, but I think of myself as sort of not first and foremost part of that community. I guess I'm part of a broad behavioral science community, but that's sort of too broad to think about. So when I think about, well, what's my community? I suppose I guess I think of myself as a sort of behavioral and experimental economist first and foremost. And when I think about where would I like that to be going? I mean, I don't think it's really for me to say, oh, you ought to be working on this, you ought to be working on that. But I suppose I've got kind of hopes about what it might be like in 10 years. But I suppose my hopes are pretty broad brush things that I'd like it to be, you know, a community of open-minded researchers who are, you know, actively exchanging ideas and discovering new things and offering different explanatory perspectives. I'd like it to be a sort of productive community that's doing interesting things. And I suppose I'd like to think that it displays sort of tolerance for trying to do things in different ways and trying out different ways of exploring things. And this is where I think I begin to connect maybe to this issue of sort of replication. Because I think, I mean, I think people have been concerned about replication. And I sort of see why. You know, you sort of look at a bunch of results and you find only a proportion of, you know, whether is it too small a proportion of the claim results in the best journals fail to replicate. I mean, obviously it differs from phases to phases. But it seems like a sort of part of reaction to this seems to me a sort of tendency to try and be prescriptive about it. And certainly, you know, if I look at what direction of travel in behavioral economics, it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on laying down rules for what you should be doing. You know, there's more and more emphasis on pre-registration and pre-analysis plans and these kinds of things. And I don't know, on the whole, I'm not sure that's a good direction of travel. That's particularly helpful, that kind of prescriptive approach. In some ways, I think it's creating barriers of entry to people to kind of get on with stuff and do stuff that could turn out to be useful. So it seems like what that's trying to do, it's almost like it's trying to say, well, we've got to be sure, or more confident, at least as confident that we can be, that a particular individual result is reliable. It's kind of focus on trying to make the individual claim, try and legislate that stands up well. And I think that's the wrong approach, really. I think the thing to do is to try and sort of rely on the dynamics of communities over time to be producing good findings, and that we're places where over time you'll discover things that are interesting and useful. And I think it's just part of science that you'll try lots of things that you think might produce interesting results, and they won't, and they'll fail, and they won't replicate. But then the things that become like the interesting centerpieces of research programs are the things that do replicate, and the things that are sort of interesting enough to find out whether they replicate or not. So, if there's something in the literature that doesn't replicate, we'll either find that out because people will be sufficiently interested in it to want to explore it further, or they won't be interested enough to try and replicate it. And then over time, it'll just sort of die away into the background. And the things that have become, really, really important stuff is the stuff that does replicate, and that it has been interesting enough for people to try and find out whether or not it replicates. So I'm not sure I'm really occupied by, concerned about a crisis in replicability. Sure, lots of things don't replicate, but that's science for you, and it's about discovering the things that do, and maybe that's what communities do. And I suppose, when I was I guess an earlier scholar, I got quite interested in reading philosophy of science, and I suppose the work of Paul Feyerabend left a bit of a bit of an imprint on me, and his view was, well, you can't legislate good science because science is sort of messy and unpredictable, and interesting things emerge as a consequence of accident. So you sort of got to let people get on with it, and in healthy communities, sort of hopefully interesting things emerge. And I certainly know that. I mean, I think one of the most perhaps one of the most novel things I discovered, which was very surprising. This came out of work with Bob Sugden and Graham Looms. We discovered completely by accident. It was a sort of phenomenon we discovered because in our setup, we'd introduced some kind of variation of a factor that we had no idea it would make any difference. We didn't even realize we were varying something until we discovered this phenomenon. And then we discovered this new effect. And basically it was, we were using displays where we were representing probabilities in strips. And visually, we were sometimes splitting up blocks of probability. So a probability of 30%, we might display as 15% chances of something. And it was really in sort of tests of regret theory that this splitting up of probability became a useful way of testing a feature of regret. And we were finding effects that we thought were regret effects. But effectively, it was about this visual splitting up of the probabilities. And really, we'd left something uncontrolled. But discovering that, in fact, 2 lots of 15% is worth more to people than a 30%, we thought that was, in the end, that was an interesting discovery, and it completely undermined other things that we thought we'd been finding out and we've been writing a lot about. And but you know, so it goes. That was an example of the sort of messy discovery process, and so I think my vision is for a community that isn't too bound in rules on, you ought to do it like this, you ought to do it like that, this is what good science is, this is what a good model is, this is what a good experiment is. Hopefully a sort of open-minded community that allows kind of tolerance and flexibility in ways of doing things. I think that's my long-winded vision.
That's very interesting point of view. By the way, some excellent journals, for example, Journal of Economic Psychology, they don't mind at all studies without pre-registrations. In fact, they even encourage, they ask not to mention whatever you did a pre-registration or not. So some of the journals completely agree with your, or at least partly agree with your point of view.
Good to hear.
Yeah, and another thing is that nowadays I think the boundaries between the different communities are very blurred. Like kind of economists work together with marketing guys and machine learning and psychologists and with whom know. Yeah, but don't you think that when very famous researchers do fraudulent research, and maybe based on this fraudulent research, some policymakers try to do some implications or whatnot, it can make a lot of harm to us as a community.
Oh yeah, I'm not in favor of fraud at all, and absolutely. And I think honesty is really important and something we need to, you know, promote and encourage and instill sort of integrity and honesty. That seems to me to be hugely important, and fraud is definitely bad. I'm just not sure that, you know, coming up with rules that you impose is the way to achieve honesty. Because I mean, you know, if you wanted, if you know, you could be dishonest about whether you pre-registered something, couldn't you? So, you know, you run your experiments, and then the ones that you like the results from, pre-register them. So if you intend to be dishonest, I don't think pre-registration is going to fix that. So I agree. I think fraud and dishonesty is terrible. In fact, you know, one of the worst things you could do is be dishonest. I just don't think that this is a kind of the emphasis on writing down particular rule. I mean, if you want to write down a rule, you ought to be honest. I mean, I'm in favor of that rule. But yeah.
I still completely agree with you on that one. Orestis, what is your opinion the most impressive finding in social science from the last, let's say, 10 years or so?
Yeah, so it's always tricky to predict what kind of passes the test of time. So I'll try and hedge my bets here. Is it okay if I very briefly mention two papers that I actually okay. So one is probably very well known to most people, and one is lesser known, but I think it's also quite important. What I find is like the connecting link between these two papers is that they both open up new methods for accessing information that we couldn't easily tap into before. So the first development stems from a paper called Attention is All You Need. It's published in 2017. This paper introduced what's known as the transformer architecture, which is the foundation behind advanced AI systems like GPT. And even though this is not this is a machine learning paper, so I think the aftermath of the AI boom that ensued, its publication has already found its way to social science research. And what makes me excited about these developments is that It's opening new doors for how we handle qualitative data, that is the reads and detailed information gathered from open-ended questions that researchers, maybe particularly in fields like economics, often were very reluctant to touch, or particularly because they were very challenging to analyze systematically. And thanks to this advancement, I think we are now much better equipped to explore vast amounts of this type of data and potentially unlocking new insights into human behavior and cognition, which I think is very exciting. The second paper I want to draw attention to is called, it has a long name. It's called A Solution to the Single Question Crowd Wisdom Problem. It's published in Nature, also in 2017, by Drazen Prelek and co-authors. And it introduces a novel way of aggregating information with the idea of harnessing the wisdom of the crowds, which they call the surprisingly popular algorithm. The algorithms simply ask people to state, besides their guess to the question at hand, how popular they think their answer was in this population. And this approach kind of leverages a kind of social sensing, people's ability to gauge the opinions of others. And the clever twist there is that often those who know the less obvious correct answer are also aware that it's not the most common one. And using this method, the algorithm effectively kind of distinguishes the truly informed opinions from other guesses, especially in situations where the truth is counterintuitive and where correct and incorrect answers are stated with equal confidence, so that the traditional methods of aggregation would fail. So that's my second nomination for a very important paper. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So basically, it seems, at least from the papers that you mentioned, that the AI and the new algorithms are kind of changing not only our lives, but how we do research as well, and impact it in numerous ways.
Yeah, especially for empiricists, I think having access to or being able to tap into new sources of information is quite exciting, and the possibilities are infinite. So I can't foresee for sure which paper will turn out to be the most important 10 years from now, but at least those papers kind of open up methods and new potential data sources that we can play with. So I feel excited about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Chris, going back to you, what is your advice for young scholars? I, for example, also consider myself as a young scholar. Orestis, maybe you will relate as well.
Chris might relate as well.
So, Chris.
Well, I think my first piece of advice would be enjoy it while it lasts, because it doesn't seem long ago at all that I was going to conferences and I was thinking of myself probably reasonably as one of the new kids on the block. And so the transition from the new kid on the block to be one of the people who gets asked the kind of the old timer questions has happened far too rapidly. So do enjoy it while it lasts. But so I mean, I find the question a sort of one that creates a bit of cognitive dissonance, partly because it reminds you of the swift passage of time and a career. But I also find it a sort of question that generates a bit of cognitive dissonance, because when I think about it, I'm not sure that I really have pearls of wisdom that I think, well, this is the one thing that you really want to know if you want to be successful. But to to sort of try and be a bit more constructive in my response, I tried to think about, well, are the particular things, if I think back, that have really helped me? What are the things that have been sort of most beneficial to me in my career that I think were really important ingredients in whatever success I might have had, such as it is? And what are things that have been sort of things that on reflection, I think, well, perhaps it would have been better if, I hadn't done that, or I'd avoided some influence. And I think in terms of things that have helped, two things really stand out. Neither of which I think really, well, maybe one of them nets out in terms of a potential strand of advice. The first one definitely doesn't, because I think one of the things that's helped me is I think I've been lucky in certain respects, and one, being in the right place at the right time for things, there's definitely been important. So for one of the perhaps most important bits of luck for me was in being in the right place at the right time to become a student of Bob Sugden's, and that was just a huge element of good luck for me, because he's just fantastic person to work with, who's also sort of super supportive and generous with their time, and that's incredibly influential. But maybe the second thing that I think has been hugely beneficial is in finding myself working in environments that are sort of collaborative, being part of a group of people who, in some sense, sort of share a kind of community interest in trying to sort of develop together a sort of an intellectual community, and being willing to share. And so being in an environment with a, a sort of collaborative bunch of good people who really want to get on with doing sort of good science together. And so so how could that net out as advice? Well, trying to join those communities, but making yourself a good player in those communities, trying to be a good sort of team player and contributing to public goods. Of course, with the caveat that, that's only going to work if you're in an environment that's not populated too much by free riders. So, you're obviously contributing lots of public goods if other people aren't doing it probably isn't a good idea. But try to find communities and join to them, and by being someone who will contribute without looking for the instant payoff, on the basis that this looks like a good community to be part of. That seems to me like a good thing. But then when I think about kind of mistakes, I think one mistake on reflection that I think I might have made is being too diversified, being trying to sort of work on too many diverse things. Probably it's happened more as I've got older. So maybe the costs to doing it have been less as I've got older, but I think probably I've been too diversified. But I think the last thing I'd say is, last piece of advice would probably, don't put too much weight on what older scholars say is the right thing to do. I mean, if I think back to my very early days of research, I think, if I think about what was it that older scholars were saying about were the right and wrong ways to do, one of the obvious things that scholars were saying when I was a graduate student was that economics is a non-experimental science. And so, if I think about the textbooks at the time, like a textbook by Richard Lipsey, the first chapter of that, or probably second chapter actually, was about economics as a science, and explaining how you do good economics, and you build models, and you test them. You test them by comparing them with data. Where does the data come from? Well, being a non-experimental science, the way that where the data comes from, you sort of gather it from the field. And very definite about it being non-experimental. And then, of course, I ran into Bob Sugden, who was saying, "Oh, I'm doing experiments. Are you interested in doing that?" It seemed like a sort of very odd thing to be doing, but I remember, so various other professors around at the time were sort of saying, "Look, you really shouldn't. Don't waste your time doing that, because that isn't sort of proper economics." And so I think it comes back to sort of maybe being prepared to break the rules of the conventional wisdom, or at least not feeling bound by them if you think you've got good approaches or ideas that don't fit with the conventional wisdom. Then be prepared to do it your way, I think, be my top tip for what it's worth.
Thank you. I think actually you give very interesting tips, and they're not only for young scholars, but actually for everyone, and also not only in the research, but basically anywhere. So if I can summarize it, first of all, do what you enjoy, which I think is a great recipe for happiness in general. Like if you,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah. The second one is actually I a little bit disagree with you. I do agree that luck plays a huge role, but I disagree that it is not an advice. It is an advice in the sense that I believe that luck plays with those who try enough and are not afraid of mistakes. So you have to be persuasive. You have to try. Like many people just come across opportunities and just don't see these opportunities, move around and don't use them. So I do believe each and every one of us has their fair share of luck. Just some of us know how to exploit it and use it, and some not. So in this sense, I completely agree with you on the luck, and you have to not be afraid of trying and failing and trying again, etc., etc. And I definitely agree with you about being around good people, or trying to surround yourself with good people. I have to remind myself about not being too spread around.
Yeah.
And not to be afraid. This is also interesting point. Not to be afraid of trying new things. I think this is one of the advantages of being in academia. You can try new things, especially if you can try whatever.
And I think the key thing there was not so much that they knew, more that they're sort of going against conventional wisdom.
Conventions.
Don't be afraid to break the conventional wisdom if you think you've got a good reason for doing it.
This is probably
And using the term that you brought up earlier, Yefim, about not being afraid to try and maybe even make some mistakes. Essentially, don't be too affected by the hot stove effect, right? So be explorative. And I also wanted to say, yeah, that although we put Chris in the category of no longer a young scholar, I wanted to say that to the extent that being passionate about research, playful with new ideas, and inquisitive are threads of youthfulness. Then in that sense, Chris is very much still like a very young scholar. And yeah. So I don't know if that's advice, but it is. I think it's at least maybe it's not a career advice, but it is probably life satisfaction advice. If you can maintain that kind of passion, youthfulness, and playfulness to your later years in academia, then you're probably at least going to have a better time doing the work. So yeah,
could be true. Could be true.
I think it's also a career advice in the sense that if you don't enjoy what you are doing, maybe it's better to look for another career, like just being stuck in things that you don't enjoy.
Yeah.
Why bother? Like do other things which you will enjoy. Okay, Orestis, our last question for today, fortunately or unfortunately, which book will you recommend us and our readers to read?
Yeah, so many books really come to mind, but I think to honor the memory of Daniel Kahneman, who sadly passed away earlier this year, I would highly recommend the Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. It's a book that beautifully captured the personal dynamics of the collaboration between Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose contribution to social sciences is really hard to overstate. So Daniel and Amos are the minds behind the conception and development of prospect theory, which is arguably one of the most influential models in behavioral sciences, really. Their groundbreaking work was, in fact, recognized in the Nobel Prize in 2002, which was awarded to Kahneman. Had Amos Tversky not passed away, sadly, some years before that, he would no doubt have shared this honor. Nobel Prizes are not awarded posthumously. The book does a great job in summarizing in simple and accessible terms the core of the ideas that the duo developed over several years. And it does so with great attention to how the ideas were conceived and developed, putting the reader in the point of view of the researcher. And it also kind of highlights the human component behind these ideas that makes them less abstract and distant as they might feel to some people when reading the academic papers. While at the same time, in line with Chris's advice earlier about the importance of collaborative work, and it does so in exalting the benefits of a good academic collaboration, which is much of what I also feel makes doing science in the first place so exciting. So that's a book that I often recommend to students in my behavioral economics course, and I hope whoever listens to this gives it a try as well.
Okay, guys, Orestis and Chris, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure having you around. And I again remind our listeners, if you have not listened to the Decision from Experience in Environments with Individual and Social Uncertainty lecture, definitely go and listen to it. It's very interesting. And I want to thank you for your time.
Well, thanks very much for the invite and hosting and running such a great series. Really, really nice to be involved.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yefim.